Hi, this is Debbie from CorpU, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Leading the Adaptive Enterprise, with our featured panelist, Stanton Wortham. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Should you have any issues during the webinar, please use the question box and I will assist you. Today's event will be recorded and shared at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Alan from CorpU to get us started. Alan?
All right, thank you, Debbie. Welcome everyone to Leading the Adaptive Enterprise, Become a Learning Organization. So this is our Smarter Growth series. Every month we bring key insights rooted in management science, and I'm really excited today to speak with and have everyone listen to and meet Stanton Wortham. So Stanton and I go back more than a decade when he was the Associate Dean at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was teaching in the doctoral program in workplace learning and leadership. Stanton was one of those teachers. Although he's won many teaching awards, he's published more articles in referee journals than you could ever imagine, and business books like Bullish on Uncertainty, academic books on things like discourse analysis. He became known as the guy at Penn that speaks in full paragraphs. So that was the fun part of listening to Stanton speak. But more importantly, Stanton was somebody who changed a lot of my thinking as someone who's been in the learning and development industry for 30 years in the corporate world. It was back in 2008 timeframe with Stanton when he opened my eyes to a new world of sociocultural view of learning, and started to change the way I thought about all learning and all e-learning. So I'm really excited to have you with us today, Stanton. So let me, thanks for being here. We're excited to have you. And let me just tee up today. I think, as I mentioned, so there's been no shortage of money invested in learning and leadership. And if we look at the last 3 decades of investment, we see that we still have a majority or supermajority of leadership positions are filled with outsiders. Employee engagement, it just continues to hover near all-time low. Manager tenures continue to get shorter. So a lot of this money, the question is, where is it all going, and where's the value? And Harvard Business School folks, Michael Beer and his colleagues, wrote a research paper called The Great Training Robbery, and in it they summarized that of the $164 billion spent on an annual basis, that the overwhelming evidence shows that corporations are unable to transfer employee learning into changes in behavior. So simply put, that money, they're not getting a very big return on investment for that money. So I think as you look at culture change, the great Kurt Lewin, the organizational and social psychologist, gave us a formula. And I think it's a really, it's a perfect formula for us to think about. And he says behavior change, he said many, many decades ago, but it's a function of the person and the environment, the system, that you can't change one without changing the other if you wish to have lasting change. So I think that's a nice underpinning for today's topic. And this second part of that is at Burson by Deloitte, they've put out a maturity model, Josh Burson, in these years, and it's probably the most widely used maturity model in organizational learning. And I think the thing that I take from this is that an enormous amount of energy is invested in learning and development and leadership development in these more tactical and operational focused learning areas, and that not enough is spent in the strategic learning. And when I think of strategic learning, or you describe it by looking at the Burson by Deloitte model, it's developing leaders who can build organizational capability and shape cultures for learning and drive business performance. So that strategic aspect of learning is where we will be situating today's talk, and where Stanton will focus. And just to continue to stand on the shoulders of the giants that have come before us, I think Stanton might call me hyperbolic from time to time, but Peter Senge said learning organizations are are places where people continually expand their capacity to create the results they truly desire, where collective aspiration is set free and people continually learn how to learn together. They learn how to win at learning. And so all of those things have been put together in a CorpU learning journey that we built with Stanton that is helping organizations navigate and build adaptive enterprises. So build that agility and organizational learning system so that behavior change can take root and stick and drive performance. So with that as our backdrop, Stanton, I'm going to turn it over to you to walk us through how to make sense of this fast-changing world and how to develop people and organizations in a way that lasts. Stanton?
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. I hope that we'll have a chance to review a couple of central insights and get some feedback and questions from all of you about how you're working in your organizations to manage some of these challenges. So the world, as you know, changes quite quickly. We have factors like globalization, where you have to compete with folks who are overseas. You have to engage in supply chains that involve things stretching around the world. You have to worry about new government regulations and currencies and various other factors, including new technologies that are forcing organizations to react more rapidly to things that challenge them. So if you could give me the next slide, Alan. So the environments change quickly, and the only way that an organization can adjust to these changes in environments is to have people who are adaptable and capable of making the changes. One of the fundamental truths about change in the contemporary world and also before is that we can't predict exactly what's going to happen. You can't predict what sorts of new regulations will occur, what sorts of new technologies will be developed that all of a sudden disrupt an industry or give competitors an advantage. What sort of shifts in the global environment are going to cause your organization to not be able to do things the way that you've been doing things. Those unexpected challenges they require people in order to address them. You can't just have a new strategy. You can't say, we're going to build a strategy. You can't automate adaptation to these shifts. And the reason you can't automate it or you can't predict it with a strategy is because you don't know what it's going to be. So the challenge that's going to come up and bite you is something that, in principle, you can't predict in advance. And therefore, the only way to address it is to have people who are capable of adapting and adjusting to the new situations as they come up. So learning, therefore, is critical to a contemporary organization, because if you don't have a system for helping people learn such that they can figure out what the new challenges are and develop creative solutions to them, the organization isn't going to be able to survive over time. That when environments change, as we all know, individuals and species go extinct. And in rapidly changing environments, you have to have species that are adaptable. You have to have people who are capable of figuring out what's going on, seeing the new opportunities in the changes, and pushing the organization to creative solutions that move forward. So the challenge that we're facing today in contemporary business environments is a dramatic one of developing people to be able to address challenges that we don't know what they're going to be. It's parenthetically the same problem you face as a parent. You know, you're raising children in order to face situations that you can't know about, and they're going to be independent of you when they face those challenges, but you are responsible for developing them such that they can do it. It's the same thing in a business. You have to help your people develop so that they'll be able to deal with new things that you can't even imagine. Next slide, Alan, please. So now we're going to do
time for a poll. Yep. Thank you. So we're going to put a poll up. Ask everybody to jump in and give us the answer to which one of these is most important to creating an adaptive organization. So we're collecting responses. Results are coming in. Interesting distribution. They keep changing. How much longer, Debbie? 15 more seconds? 15 more seconds. And by the way, while people are voting, please feel free to ask us any questions in the question box as Stanton is going through. And as we have questions that come in, we'll pop those up as well, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A on the back half. So here we go. What do you think, Stanton?
Well, I think that, in fact, any one of these answers is a reasonable answer. I think an organization actually has to do all four of these things. And it's interesting to see the distribution a little more at the top and at the bottom. And if we go to the next slide, you can see four things represented as four different ways to imagine reacting to unpredictable environments that require adaptation and developing people who will be able to adapt quickly. So the first thing to say is that, of course, an organization has to develop individuals' knowledge and skills. If you don't have people who know relevant things and who have skills to be able to manage the kinds of challenges in whatever business you're in, you can't succeed at doing what you need to do. And traditional talent development is something that provides knowledge and skills for people, and clearly we need to keep doing that. One of the central points I want to make in the next few slides is to say that while the development of individual knowledge and skills is critical, it's not sufficient. To build an adaptive organization, to create people who are going to be able to manage unpredictable and changing environments, you have to go to the other three quadrants of this diagram as well. So Alan, if you could go to the next slide for me. So in addition to developing individual knowledge and skills, you also have to develop individual dispositions. So by disposition, I mean something that is more enduring than a piece of knowledge or a skill. That the kind of stuff that we learn in school tends to be knowledge, tends to be skills. They're discrete things that you're able to help someone develop mastery of that they can then transfer and use in other settings. And of course, that's critical. But dispositions are more entrenched, long-term, and generally applicable ways of responding to other people and situations that are more difficult to develop. So up here we have dispositions to openness and listening and questioning. We'll talk about this a little bit more. But some people are particularly good listeners. They're just able to hear what others say and not to filter through their own biases, but genuinely listen to what someone else is thinking. That's a disposition. It's something that takes time to develop, and it's something that you'll use in many contexts. The willingness to admit errors and ask for help is a crucial one that we all wish we had more people like that in our organizations. That to think you know everything is a bad disposition, it's a bad habit, and we need to develop the capacity to be able to admit we don't know something and to be willing to ask for help, to not fear that we're going to look weak for doing that. Another disposition is empathy, that to be able to understand, to feel what another person is experiencing is something that takes time to develop, and it's something that is important and can be applied in many different contexts. So the sets of dispositions that an individual needs in your organization will vary somewhat depending on the business you're in and the role that they're playing. But the first point here is just, in addition to people who do learning and talent development being responsible for building knowledge and skills in individuals, they are also responsible for building dispositions. And that can't be done just through a one-off class. You just can't sit somebody down in front of a PowerPoint or have a quick discussion and expect to make somebody empathic or to teach somebody how to listen or help them be willing to ask for help. Those are things that require more sustained interventions. They require working with somebody over time and have a strategy for how you're going to change them a little bit as a human being and how they respond to others in the world. So the next slide, please, Alan.
All right.
So the first two responsibilities of a learning professional had to do with individuals. In order to make an adaptable organization, your responsibility is to help the individuals in your organization become certain kinds of people, get the knowledge and skills they need, and develop certain kinds of dispositions that will change them a little more deeply over time. But also, an organization can only become adaptive in a rapidly changing environment if you change organizational systems as well. And about half of you said this in your responses to the poll, and I agree completely that developing individuals is crucial, but changing organizational processes is just as important. The first kind of change on this slide, single loop learning, has to do with shifting organizational processes by developing new ways of trying to help that organization respond. There's an example on this slide about navigating a battleship. And what that means is there's a famous study trying to answer the question of, how do you steer a battleship? How do you know where your battleship is? And how do you decide what to turn and when in order to make it go where you want to go? And you would think that there's one person on a battleship who knows where the ship is and turns the wheel, and that's how you steer a battleship, kind of the way you steer a car. Turns out it's not that simple, that battleships are big enough that you have to start turning a long way before you get to the spot where you actually want to have turned. And it requires more than one person to be able to figure out where you are and where you need to turn in order to get where you want to go. So when they have battleships of a big enough size in a small area like a harbor, they actually every minute go through a process. They call it the fix cycle, where they figure out where they are and where they need to go. And it involves at least half a dozen people up on the deck of the ship taking bearings, trying to figure out where the ship is in relation to landmarks, people looking at a map and marking on a map where it is that the battleship is and doing triangulation of figuring out what the bearings are and drawing on the map where the ship has to be. And then people double checking by checking the depth underneath the keel of the boat and looking at the chart and making sure that where you think you are, the water is actually as deep as the chart says, otherwise you might have made a mistake. And the point here is that in your organization, like in navigating a battleship, the crucial tasks you do require groups of people working together in systems together with their tools. On the battleship, they have charts and they have computers and they have logbooks and they have communication through language and they spatially organize themselves in particular ways. In your organization, you do a range of tasks that depend on systems of people and tools. And one way to make your organization adaptive is to improve those systems through which you get done your core tasks. So one example here of single loop learning is, as we develop new information technology, we're able to do a job, like in this case, identify clients more effectively. So once it used to be that you had to use networks and you had to write down in books potential prospects if you were trying to sell them things. And as those lists of prospects got developed, you had individuals who had relationships with them and they would coordinate with each other about who would contact whom, and they would try to work their prospects to find out other possible prospects who were in similar industries or similar situations. Nowadays, we have information technology that's capable of gathering and retaining and analyzing a lot more information. So the fundamental task, identifying potential prospects, seeing if you can sell them things, is the same, but the task is made much more efficient by having information technology that's capable of helping you do it by retaining more information, seeing connections you couldn't see before, drawing on external databases that give you information you didn't have access to in prior eras. So single loop learning, do what you're already doing, but do it better because you're able to introduce a new tool or a new system or new expertise that allows you to do it better. The next one, Alan. Double loop learning is a little more difficult to get your head around, but it's more important because double loop learning isn't just change your organizational system by doing the same job more efficiently. It's actually changing the nature of what the system is, a more transformational change. Here on the slide it says, challenging the assumptions embedded in your systems. Single loop learning is about becoming more efficient, becoming better at doing what it is you're already doing. Double loop learning is about changing the nature of what you're doing so that you're doing something that reaches the same goal of selling more of what you're selling or reaching more clients, but you do it by transforming the way that you proceed, by transforming the actions that you take. So we did a study that was published in the book that Alan mentioned called Bullish on Uncertainty, which was a study of investment banks, Wall Street investment banks. And many of these banks operate the way typical organizations do, where they develop strategy at the top. They decide they're going to go into a particular industry this year, and they instruct their bankers on the targets of how much they're supposed to sell, which clients they're supposed to contact in this new industry that they've decided to go into. And that sort of top-down strategy is typical for the way many of these organizations run. But in one of these banks that we worked in, they decided that strategy was getting in the way of them being able to respond quickly to opportunities in the environment. And so they allowed strategy to be created by bankers who had direct contact with clients. This is a quote from one of them, that one day they looked back and noticed they had a healthcare strategy. It's not that somebody from the top decided that we're going to go into healthcare this year. It's that people noticed opportunities as they worked with clients that they had contact with anyway. And they got together and started realizing, hey, we can sell them something. We can create a new product that they're going to need, even though they don't quite know it yet. So this is double loop learning, because it isn't just making strategy more effective. It isn't just communicating your strategy better or changing the timeline on which you develop your strategy or getting better metrics for delivering your strategy and measuring your success. This is changing the nature of your strategy. It's not top down anymore, it's bottom up. Another thing this bank did that was a type of double loop learning was, typically in your organization, people just get information on what it is that they need. In other words, you have a certain job, you're a banker, your job is mergers and acquisitions, and you specialize in financial services or you specialize in healthcare. Those are the industries you're responsible for. And you'll get information on what's going on in those industries with respect to the stuff that a mergers and acquisitions banker has to know about. In this bank, they discovered that if bankers knew things outside their area of expertise, so the healthcare bankers learned stuff about manufacturing, and the folks who were responsible for manufacturing learned stuff about financial services, it turns out that that breadth of information allowed them to see things in the broader economy that got them ahead of their clients in terms of imagining problems or opportunities that were coming up that they could try to solve proactively. And so what they started doing is they started giving all their bankers information on broad swaths of the economy, overwhelming amounts of information that people had never done before, because they thought the bankers would be so overwhelmed by it that they wouldn't be able to function. But in fact, by learning about other industries and other kinds of financial products, they were able to come up with creative new ideas that they wouldn't have been able to see if they were focusing just on the silo that they were responsible for. So that was double loop learning. It was a change in the way that they approached problems as opposed to just making more efficient what they did anyway. So double loop learning is a second example of how you could change your organization's processes in order to make them not more efficient, but in order to make them fundamentally different, in order to reframe the way you do something like strategy or like giving information to your frontline employees, and doing it in a way that opens up new opportunities. So those are the four quadrants of that slide. An organization, to be adaptable, has to do all of those things. Knowledge and skills for your individuals, change your individuals' dispositions, make your existing organizational systems and processes more efficient, and rethink, transform some of your key organizational processes so you're able to do things you weren't able to do before. And I think we have another poll, right, Alan?
We do, but Stanton, if we could, I have a number of questions coming in. I just wondered, Arturo wants to know is there a source for the quadrants?
Is there a source? No, I made it up. So, I mean,
I figured as much.
We could give you references. Single loop and double loop learning is classic stuff. We could give you the reference for that. But the four put together in this way, I did not take it from one particular place, no.
Yeah. Okay. And I thought that was yours, and I would say, Arturo, I would quote that as a Stanton Wortham sourced quadrant, which would have more credibility to me than any other source you could put out there. So that's my biased opinion. And just while we're at it, Stanton, I'm wondering for John. I like this question because it was relevant to your battleship, and he asked it before you did the battleship. John asked, "What advice do you have for developing leaders who are sailing an organization the size of an aircraft carrier, but they expect it to be able to steer it and have it perform like a speedboat?" And by the way, he says, "I love this webinar." So thank you, John, for that feedback for Stanton. I just wanted to keep you in the loop, Stanton.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, it's a serious challenge, because to manage an organization at a certain scale, this is why so often you have family-owned businesses that run wonderfully in the startup phase, and then whoever's running them can't make the transition in order to have a bigger organization that's able to manage multiple functions and integrate them. So it's a challenge to be able to figure out how do you develop processes and people such that they can make the various components or interrelated systems that make up an aircraft carrier function. It is a different kind of task than just steering the boat with one steering wheel.
Yep. Very good point. All right, let's move on to the next poll. Everybody get your fingers ready and let's get voting. How do you prepare your organization to navigate uncertainty? A question that's teed up from the man who wrote the book, Bullish on Uncertainty. So I think you have something to tell us about. We're going to leave this poll open for another 30 seconds or so. So keep voting. Two more, 3 more seconds. What do you think, Debbie? We done? All right, here we go. The answer is Stanton, thoughts?
Well, nobody likes experts, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
And so, again, with these, I think that there's a case to be made for all of these answers, but I have several thoughts about various components here, if we could move on to the next one.
Yep. Here we go.
So experts are not in themselves a bad thing, but to have people who really know a lot about a particular industry or a particular process or product, that is a good thing. We all have to have some expertise, otherwise we can't do our jobs. But as many of you probably were thinking as you answered the poll, that experts are also dangerous. That the reason an expert is dangerous is that experts sometimes get too enamored with their own expertise. So someone who's an expert has done a particular task over and over and over again. So if we stick with the investment bankers, that people who had been involved in mergers and acquisitions in a particular industry for decades thought that they had seen it all. They thought that they knew how it is that these processes went. And of course, each deal was a little bit different, and they had to tailor things in order to try to take advantage of this, and the dollar amounts kept getting bigger. So there were some shifts, but basically they thought, I know more about this than anybody. And knowing a lot in itself is not bad, but believing you know a lot can be bad, because if an environment is changing around you, then by definition, you have not seen a case like the one that you're seeing now. If the environment is stable, experts are fine because they've seen it before, they know a lot about it, they can have really good creative insights about how to manage a situation. But if the environment is changing, the expert has to be willing to see that he or she does not know fully what it is that's going to happen, because the world is different than in those prior cases that they have experience with. And as a result, experts often miss new problems and new opportunities because they see what they're used to seeing, and they don't see how a situation is a little bit different and therefore brings up a new challenge or faces a new opportunity. And when you have people that long-term capital management, was a massive hedge fund run by academic experts who thought they were smarter than anybody else, and they thought they knew how markets behaved, and the chances of a big crash in their portfolio were 0.01%, and the thing crashed. And the reason it crashed is because they weren't bothering to pay attention to how the markets were shifting around them, and stuff that they had seen before didn't apply in the new world. The last point on this slide about experts is it's really important to see that expertise isn't just a cognitive phenomenon. So experts aren't just dangerous because they think they know a lot and their models don't fit the way the world is as the world is changing. The danger is also that experts are personally invested. They have emotional investments. They have ego investments in being experts. One of the banks that we worked with, the investment bankers, the star investment bankers, just loved to be on the front cover of the glossy trade magazines. And they were the hottest banker in healthcare, or the hottest banker in mergers, or whatever it is that they were. And they loved it because it suited their image of themselves as being better than everybody else and deserving a certain sort of deference. And that investment, which is an emotional thing, it has to do with your sense of identity, all of that is wound up in a package And so the package of an expert who has somewhat misleading perceptions because the world is changing in ways they don't anticipate, and is also deeply emotionally invested in that, is a dangerous package. So I'm not saying here that expertise in itself is bad. Skills, knowledge, experience, that kind of insight can be critical, but you have to try to maintain the skills, the knowledge, the insight without bringing along the overconfidence and the inability to see changes as they occur. Next one, Alan. Can you give me the next slide, Alan?
Yeah, it's not changing. Can you change, Debbie, on your side?
So while you guys are...
Yeah, hold on. I apologize. My something happened to my machine, and I have 3 computers here, and the only one that I'm on is not changing.
So why don't I go ahead? Why don't I go ahead and talk about the next set of issues while you guys work on getting them up there?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about the. I'll have this fixed in a second. But you're on openness.
Right. So the next slide is titled Openness as an Alternative. So expertise is dangerous, as we've said. Strategy can also be dangerous. So strategy has the same risk as expertise. Strategy is not a bad thing. It's good to have some sense of where you're going and to think about your larger goals and your techniques for getting there. So strategy as a general concept is not bad, but strategy has some of the same dangers that expertise does, because a strategy is worked out by people who are in a particular time and place, who may not have direct contact with clients or others that get worked with on the ground. And strategy can be too coarse a tool. Strategy cannot be delicate enough in order to be able to see as the environment shifts, in order to be able to pick up on the changes and the new opportunities that those changes are bringing. So strategy too, you have to take it with a grain of salt. You have to be a little careful not to just implement a strategy, but to think about, as the environment shifts, how do I have to change my strategy? And one kind of disposition that I'm recommending as a way to try to overcome the dangers of expertise and strategy is to try to remain open to new information. Some of the bankers that we worked with were particularly good at listening to clients. In some of the banks, they would show up, and what they would do is they would have a big glossy book, a pitch book, and the pitch book would have color pictures of all of them, and it would have all sorts of analyses, and they would basically show up at their initial meeting telling the client what they were going to do. And this pitch often was really smart and had a lot of good ideas in it, was based on a lot of expertise, but they didn't bother to listen to the client and find out things the client knew that were going to be relevant to tailoring a solution to that particular business. Other bankers were much better at listening. Sometimes they would show up with just a spreadsheet. So they would just show up with a spreadsheet, and they'd be asking the client, hey, can you tell me the right number to plug into our spreadsheet here? And in some ways that looks a little sloppy. It doesn't look professional, but the reason they did it was because that gave them an opportunity to really hear what the client thought was critical, to really pick up on the information that was current and detailed about the situation of the particular client. So in order to be open as a disposition to try to overcome these dangers of expertise and strategy, you need to try to gather information and not assume you know. See if you can gather more information by talking to people, asking them questions, looking at new data, because it could turn out that you don't fully understand the situation that's in front of you. Even if it looks like stuff you've seen before, it's probably got some things in it that aren't exactly what you've seen before. And if you don't listen carefully, then you're not going to be able to pick up on that new information. Another important thing in order to try to remain open is to try to envision alternatives by changing your fundamental assumptions. So we think of problems in terms that we're familiar with. For example, we often think that learning is a process that goes on inside individuals. So when I say you need to learn more, your organization needs to do a better job with learning, what you think is, well, the individual people have to get more stuff, information, dispositions, and so forth. And of course, that's true. That is important. But as we talked about a couple minutes ago, learning, change in an organization in order to try to meet the demands of shifting circumstances, that change requires organizational shift as well as individual shift. So you can think about learning as a process that doesn't just involve individuals, but it as a process that involves systems beyond the individual. Like the battleship, to navigate that battleship, you need a bunch of people talking to each other with devices for taking bearings on the deck, with computer systems, with maps, with the ability to write on the maps, with logbooks, with fathometers that check the depth underneath the keel. You need a whole bunch of people and tools working together in order to get something done. And as a result, learning means changing that system. If you get a better map in that system, even if all the individuals stay the same, the system will work better because the map is better. So this is an example of trying to say that one way to remain open to new alternatives is to try to reimagine your assumptions. How am I thinking about this problem in a way that doesn't allow me to see alternatives? How can I reimagine it by thinking that learning isn't just an individual thing, but is a collective thing? That's another way to try to imagine openness as an alternative. So we talked a little bit about the dangers of expertise and the dangers of rigid strategies. And one way to move beyond it is to try to encourage openness both in the individuals as a disposition and in the systems. That the next slide that I've got has to do with another way of trying to create this sort of openness. It's titled Questioning and Listening. I guess we've got it up there now.
Should be okay. I apologize for that little error. I've done dozens and dozens of these, and I've never had one of those faults before. So my apologies. Back to you, Stanton.
So another way to try to help people move beyond the dangers of rigid ways of thinking about the world when the world is changing is to encourage a disposition that allows people to ask good questions and to listen carefully. So when an environment is shifting, what you need to do is you need to be able to pick up on the things in the environment that will give you an opportunity, an opening in order to move forward. And they won't be exactly the same as what you've been able to do in the past. Now, questions are a good model for what you need to do in order to be successful at that kind of adaptation. And the reason is that questions are not completely open-ended. If you ask a question, you are directing the listener to try to attend to something, to answer your question, as opposed to be able to just say whatever he or she wants to say. So questions are a good model because they provide some direction. A good question gets people to examine an important issue. But questions are also open to multiple answers. That rhetorical questions or known answer questions are not useful. Like we talk to children a lot in our societies about, so what is this called? Oh, this is a table. You just try to get the kid to tell you exactly what you already know. That's not the kind of question I'm talking about. That questions are things that admit multiple answers, and it's actually quite hard to ask a good question. So people often struggle to be able to ask questions that are productive by directing somebody's attention to something, but also giving them a chance to say what they think about it in a way that you, as the questioner, might not have anticipated. That questioning is a critical skill. It's something that a good leader is able to do, and it's particularly important in shifting environments. Because by questioning, you direct attention to something that's important to you in your organization, but you remain open to multiple ways of thinking about that issue, or multiple possible responses or strategies in response to whatever the issue is that you raise. Here there's a distinction on the slide between three different kinds of questions. So a fact question is something that we already know, like what percentage of students in US universities are female? So that's something where if you don't know the answer, that you could go and you could look it up. The answer is it's approaching 60% at this point. There is a right answer to it. We may not know it. I could be wrong, but we can find out the answer. That's a fact question. An evaluative question is a question that asks for your opinion about something that's a matter of taste. Like, do you like raw tomatoes? Personally, I don't like raw tomatoes. Everybody thinks I'm crazy. I like cooked tomatoes, but I don't like raw tomatoes. And no matter what you say to me, I'm not going to change my mind about that. So fact questions and evaluative questions can be useful in certain circumstances, but the kind of questions I'm talking about here, the kind of questioning you want someone to do to be an effective leader in an organization that's adaptive, are more interpretive questions. An interpretive question is a question where there is more than one answer and reasonable people will disagree about the appropriate answers. So you want to ask questions that admit multiple possible responses, because in an environment that's changing, you want people to be able to come up with new ideas, to notice new things that you haven't anticipated already. So one critical disposition is a questioning disposition. Going along with questioning is the ability to listen. That listening is a hard skill to master, because often in business we're taught that you have to look smart and competent and aggressive and decisive, and if you don't know exactly what you're saying, then you shouldn't say something because you'll sound weak. But that's really not useful in an environment with rapidly shifting things. No one person is smart enough in order to be able to solve the kinds of problems your organization has to solve. The only way to come up with adaptive solutions to these challenges is to be open to listening to input from various people, clients, employees, and others out in the world who might have insight into what's going on and what could be a new opportunity that's emerging in this environment for you. So questioning and listening are both critical dispositions. They're things that allow you to remain open in a way that's crucial to being adaptive. So the next slide, Alan. This slide has a lot in it, and I won't be able to talk to you about all the details of it, but I'm going to try to communicate to you an approach to dealing with uncertainty that's not as common, although it's becoming more so, but is really crucial for shifting environments. It's an approach that in our book, Bullish on Uncertainty, Alexandra Michelle and I called augmenting uncertainty. So the story is in a couple of investment banks we studied, there was one that was pretty strange. And what was strange about it was they would not allow their young bankers to have any definite information. So normally in an organization, when you hire a young person, you give them a job description, you give them responsibilities, you give them a list of do's and don'ts. In this one bank, they didn't do any of that. Every time a young banker asked a question about, well, what should I do on this? He or she would be told, look, we just have to do what the client needs. Just talk to Joe down the hall and you'll figure it out. And so they deliberately refused to let people have clear scripts or clear answers for what they should be doing in a given time. It caused an enormous amount of insecurity, but it provided a particular kind of environment where people felt uncertain all the time because they weren't sure exactly what they were responsible for. For instance, there was one strategy that this company pursued, or one technique. They called it fungible staffing. What they meant was when they had an opportunity to pitch a particular client, the deal team they would send to do the pitch was staffed by whoever was available. Most banks will staff based on expertise. So the person who's the best healthcare banker will go if it's a healthcare client, and so forth and so on. This bank staffed based exclusively on availability, which meant that even people at the vice president and sometimes the director level would end up in a pitch meeting with a client where they had never done a deal in that industry before, or they had never done a deal with that kind of financial product before. And it seems like a crazy idea. Why would you send somebody who knows nothing about healthcare into a pitch for a healthcare client? But the reason they did it was because those people, it turned out, saw stuff that the other bankers didn't see. So sometimes you were able to see something in a situation that was unfamiliar to you that you wouldn't have been able to see if it was more familiar. This is similar to the point about experts before. Now, this fungible staffing caused extraordinary anxiety among the young bankers because they'd constantly be put into situations where they didn't know what they were talking about, literally. And so they had folks who were English majors in college, but who were really smart and had been hired and didn't even know what a profit and loss statement was. They didn't know how to read a balance sheet, but they were thrown into a situation where they were making billion-dollar decisions together with the rest of their team that were dependent on that sort of information and that sort of documentation. And the expectation was, you'll figure it out, and if you don't get it, you'll ask somebody else. One last important thing about this strategy was that everybody had to ask other people for help, because everybody ended up sometimes in a situation where they didn't know what was going on, and as a result, they had to ask for help and admit they didn't know something. And as a result, this strategy of augmenting uncertainty, forcing people into situations where they can't do it themselves, that sort of a strategy was good for preparing bankers who were able to navigate uncertain environments, because it made them more flexible, more willing to look at unexpected aspects of a situation, more willing to consult others who would have new ideas. And that process of increasing your employees' uncertainty turned out to be productive in producing bankers who were able to navigate changing environments much more quickly. There's something on the slide about the developmental transition that you don't want to do this in your organization just tomorrow. You don't want to show up and say, okay, all the people who do this job are now doing a different job they know nothing about. This was part of an ecosystem in the bank that provided support so that people were able to rely on others in a way that allowed them to succeed in their business without expertise necessarily in each member of a given team. It was developmentally very challenging for a young banker to come into this setting, be thrown into situations you couldn't handle, and be forced to navigate through that uncertainty and that insecurity. So it required them to think differently about what they were. They started after a year or so, they would start to say things like, I finally figured it out. This isn't about me and how smart I am. It's about how we can pull together the resources of the organization to serve the client. And my job is to go get those resources, not to have all the answers myself. That developmental transition was painful. It took them a while to get there. But once they got there, they were able to manage in uncertain, changing environments much more effectively. Okay, Alan, so I think we've gone through those 4 slides about moving beyond expertise in order to be more open, to ask questions, to listen carefully, to manage uncertainty, to be willing to embrace uncertainty. That's a package of dispositions or approaches to help you and your organization adapt more effectively in a changing environment. And I think you've got another poll now.
Yes, we do. Next poll, if you're ready. What is the most pressing learning issue your organization faces? The most pressing. Keep coming. Votes are coming in. 60%. Keep going. We're in the 70s, 80s. Maybe 10 more seconds. Get your chance to vote. And Stanton, we have lots of questions coming in with 7 minutes to go. So I think you're hitting a lot of the points from our questions. So they're great. How about we put up that poll? Comments, and then we'll get to your conclusions.
Yeah, so again, I think any of these is a reasonable thing to pursue, and I think it's useful to think about each of them and to have a diversified strategy for how your organization can manage in changing environments. So why don't you run to the conclusion slide there?
Okie doke.
So this is just a reprise of the central things that we've been over. Learning is critical. You can't have an organization that does not learn effectively in an environment that is changing. Because as the environment changes, you have to have people and processes that are able to see new challenges and embrace new opportunities. And that means that learning is a key responsibility of leaders, that not just learning leaders, obviously a corporate learning leader, a director of talent development, or a chief people officer is responsible for helping develop the individuals in the organization. But any leader, CEOs on down, are responsible for helping the organization learn, allowing it to have people and processes that will change as the environment changes. So learning should be a day-to-day, a daily responsibility of leaders. And I've been trying to basically tell you guys 2 things as strategies for being more adaptive in a changing environment. The first one is think of learning broadly. In other words, don't focus just on knowledge and skills. Think also about changing individual dispositions, about changing organizational systems by making them more efficient, and even transforming your systems by rethinking the assumptions that underlie them. So think of learning as a broad thing. And then the last set of points had to do with openness, questioning, listening, embracing uncertainty, and not running away from it as crucial aspects of how your people and your organization should respond in a shifting environment. So those are the key points, Alan, and if you have questions, that would be great.
We do. We have lots of questions coming in, and folks keep them coming in, and we'll see if we can go on high speed. So one of the questions specifically that I had for you, Stanton, relates to in this environment about openness and uncertainty, and I'll just quote Abraham Maslow: individuals engage in learning to the extent that they're not crippled with fear and to the extent they feel safe enough to dare. What was the role, did you see, and I'm thinking particularly in your examples in the investment banks or broader, but how do you create that psychological safety, and do you see it as a prerequisite to successful organizational learning?
I mean, too much fear can be debilitating, clearly. There's been a lot written and spoken about the need to allow failure. You know, some organizations, everybody always has to be successful, and if you do something wrong, it's a blot on your record. And that kind of an organization is hard to sustain over time, because if you don't fail, you can't develop. And so allowing people to fail without fearing that it's going to damage their personal trajectories, I think, is very important. But one of the points of the banking study is that a little bit of fear, some uncertainty, being uncertain, being staffed on a team where you have no knowledge of the industry at all, of the group that you're pitching to, that's a scary thing. And these bankers were forced to face that. And the reason they were forced to face it was so that they would then become more open to multiple sources of information, and they would be willing to ask for help and engage with others. And so in that case, some fear, some uncertainty was a productive thing. So I don't think you want to avoid fear at all costs.
Yep. Okay. I think it's a topic that comes up over and over again about feeling that there has to be some kind of psychological safety for teams to perform. A quick one here from Courtney. What was the term Stanton used regarding staffing? Was it fungible staffing? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, fungible staffing. Just the notion that they staffed based on who was free. And so they staffed not based on expertise, but based on availability, which meant that you can think of it as a sort of interchangeability, that they still had different levels of people on a deal. So they would never have a deal where they had only analysts or associates staffed on the deal. They always had a vice president and sometimes a director also. But within that constraint, they would just take whoever was available, even if people weren't deep experts in the particular industry or the particular financial product.
All right. The question, there's a number of different questions around dispositions, Stanton, and are they a subset of leadership? And Mariana made a comment that in her dissertation, she discovered that waiting to develop these dispositions in adulthood in organizations will be too late, and you got to look at it in early childhood. And I figure since you're in a graduate school of education, do you have any thoughts about just as it relates to developing these dispositions earlier?
It depends, of course, on what kinds of dispositions we're talking about. That there are certain kinds of things that do seem to depend on early experience. And so, there's a lot of research on attachment and how securely attached infants are to their caregivers. And if you're not securely attached, it seems to have some effects often later in life. So there are some things that do seem quite deep, and early experience is crucial. But a lot of dispositions can nonetheless be changed over time. I mean, that's what processes like therapy or intensive religious experiences, serious meditation are for, that they get you to approach the world and other people in fundamentally different ways. And so you can learn to be more empathic, and you can learn to listen more carefully. And sometimes it takes a traumatic event for people to change at the level of dispositions, and that's unfortunate. But an organization can also organize itself so that it changes dispositions. Like the bank we've been talking about, that staffed people fungibly and forced them into situations they weren't capable of handling themselves. That was an attempt to change dispositions. It was an attempt to get people to stop thinking of themselves as experts and start thinking of themselves as one element in a team that collectively was able to solve a client problem.
So building on that, the question, and I think it relates to maybe the other bank, not the uncertainty bank. But the question is, organizations are built not to learn. They're built for predictability, standardization, reliability, and eradication of variance. So how do people, or even particularly learning leaders, successfully overcome these massive barriers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. A lot of organizations are built that way. And again, that's not bad if you have an environment that's relatively stable. So if you have a core product and you have a big market or a stable market for your core product, and you can keep doing the same stuff over and over again and succeeding, then that's a successful business strategy, as long as there are folks there who are going to keep buying what it is that you're making. And some businesses are legitimately like that. You know, I mean, Coke sells a lot of Coke, and it's been selling a lot of Coke for a long time. And that's a business that is stable. Now, they're continuing to explore other product lines and things because they know that nothing lasts forever and they can expand their revenue. But most industries aren't like that, and most companies are not that fortunate where you have a big product that everybody buys and they're going to keep buying it. And as a result, the organization has to shift. And I think that it varies from place to place exactly how you try to do that. But I think that organizations, higher education, my industry, is under significant pressure at the moment. And the environment is shifting in such a way that we're going to have to do things differently. Otherwise, we're not going to survive. And people are starting to see that. And hopefully, people at my institution will continue to see it and will be willing to invest in order to try to shift how we're going. So sometimes it takes an external threat in order to be able to push it. But good leadership can also do it as long as that leader is highly enough placed.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We've had Stanton Wortham with us today. He is the dean of the Lynch School of Education at Boston College, and a great colleague and professor of mine, and a great speaker and a multi-award-winning teacher. Published business books, academic books, teaching awards. And I think with your final point, Stanton, I'm going to bridge that right in. Coming up next month, we have Kim Cameron with us from the University of Michigan, and Kim just won an Academy of Management award a few months ago for sustaining work in the field of positive psychology. So he's one of the most prolific writers and researchers in the field of positive psychology and positive leadership, and really exciting guy and speaker. And so following up on the heels of Stanton today with our adaptable learning organization, we'll hit you next month with building a positive organization by developing positive leaders. Thank you, everybody. We're at the top of the hour. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, Stanton.
Thanks.